She disappeared in her youth and resurfaced decades later with another life, another story, and no regrets. Imagine the shock. In July 1962, a woman named Audrey Backerberg disappeared without a trace. A 19-year-old girl with simple dreams, she lived in a small town in the United States. No one would suspect that her disappearance would mark the beginning of an incredible journey, but what seemed like an eternal enigma was only just beginning. In just a few seconds, this script will show how historical documents and official reports confirm Audrey's disappearance, and how her reappearance at the age of 82 in the year 2025 transformed not only her life, but also left many perplexed. Documents from the time show an introspective young woman with plans to pursue a career and a quiet life with her family. Suddenly, in July 1962, she disappeared. Investigators searched for clues but found nothing. Testimonies from neighbors and local newspapers report that the community was in shock. Researchers, historians, and Audrey's family pored over diaries, dusty archives, and interviews. Nothing revealed her whereabouts. Her footprints were erased in time, but something in the silence of the case would begin to echo through the years. After all, why would someone disappear voluntarily and reappear so much later with a new life, without regrets? Stay with me until the end. In the next few minutes, we will discover who this woman was in 1962, who she has become in 2025, what adventures she has lived under another identity, and above all, understand why she feels she has no regrets. This story is not just a mystery. It is an intimate conversation with life that defies time. I am your guide on this intimate and personal journey that combines historical facts with deep human emotions. Together, let's explore the secrets that this old case has to reveal to us and discover how each detail speaks directly to our present and to the lives of each of us. Now, let's delve into Audrey's life in 1962, the young girl, her dreams, her disappearance. Audrey Backerberg was 19 years old and lived in the quiet town of Stoughton, Wisconsin. That summer promised to be just another ordinary season for the locals. Church parties, weekend picnics, and lazy afternoons on porches with lemonade. Audrey was a quiet young woman, described by neighbors as reserved, kind, and dreamy. She worked as a secretary in a small local office and spent most of her time with her mother and two younger brothers. There was no apparent sign of conflict, no visible drama. Until on July 17, 1962, Audrey left home in the morning, as she did every day, and never came back. Not a note, not a goodbye, just silence. The first few hours caused only uneasiness. Perhaps she had been late, perhaps she had gone to visit a friend. But as night fell and Audrey showed no signs, the discomfort turned to anguish. The police were called the next day. Posters began to be pasted up in pharmacies, markets, and churches. The community joined in a search that seemed personal to everyone. They searched forests, rivers, highways. Helicopters flew overhead. No trace was found. The investigation, led by agents from Dane County, revealed no concrete leads. The young woman had simply disappeared, like dust in the wind. In the police files, the statements collected in the following days reveal the family's mix of bewilderment and despair. Audrey's mother, in an interview with the local newspaper, said through tears, she would never do that. She would never disappear without saying a word. The case quickly caught the attention of the regional media, and for weeks, Audrey's face was splashed across newspapers and radio broadcasts. But time was cruel. Days turned into months. Months turned into years, and like so many other disappearances of the time, the case went cold. The name Audrey Backerberg came to inhabit only the memories of those who loved her and the dusty files of the police station. Officially, she was reported missing. Technically, she was never found dead, but neither was she alive. But why would a seemingly happy young woman disappear from the map? What reasons could have led her to cut all ties with her family, her town, her very identity? Was it a kidnapping, an unsolved murder, or something deeper and more deliberate? A silent choice to abandon everything and start over. Questions like these have haunted the case for decades. Behavioral experts, sociologists, and historians have tried over the years to piece together hypotheses about Audrey's disappearance. Some have argued that she might have suffered a mental breakdown and wandered off into the distance, losing her memory. Others have suggested that a forbidden romance led her to run away, but there has never been any proof, only speculation. However, a small, almost forgotten detail would have gone unnoticed if it had not been rescued by a curious researcher in 2023. A hotel registration book in Duluth, Minnesota, dated July 19, 1962, contained the name Anne B., and in handwriting that was strangely similar to Audrey's, according to samples from the city's high school. Could this be the first trace of the young woman on her escape route? It was still not much. But the seed for a new investigation had been planted. Meanwhile, life went on for the family. Audrey's mother died in the 1980s without ever knowing the fate of her daughter. The siblings grew up with the weight of the mystery, and each of Audrey's birthdays was marked by a thick, almost sacred silence. The town of Stoughton also moved on, although the memory of the disappearance still echoed like a local legend, the kind that parents tell their children about the dangers of the night. But Audrey's story was far from over. And what no one imagined was that in 2025, more than 6 decades later, that missing young woman would return to the scene, not as a hidden skeleton or a posthumous confession, but alive, in flesh, blood, and memory. At 82 years old, with a healthy appearance and a renewed identity, she returned not to explain, but to affirm, "I chose that life, and I don't regret it." This revelation would shock not only those who still remembered the case, but the entire country. Audrey, now called Anne, had built a new existence from scratch, with a new surname, a husband who never knew about her past, and a life completely disconnected from her origins. No digital traces, no social networks, an invisible woman by choice. The disappearance in 1962 was now just the first part of a meticulously planned journey. Audrey had left everything behind, not out of desperation, but out of conviction. She wanted freedom. She wanted to live a story that she felt she could not live where she was. And this impulse, although incomprehensible to many, was her driving force to disappear. When Audrey Backberg disappeared in 1962, no one imagined that, in that same month, she would begin one of the most daring and meticulously planned reinventions ever seen. With only a suitcase, a modest amount of cash, withdrawn shortly before her disappearance from a joint account with her mother, and a new identity improvised from forged documents in the mail, Audrey crossed the state of Wisconsin, crossed Minnesota, and at the end of that month arrived in the quiet town of Great Falls, Montana. It was there that Anne Becker was born, a simple, common-sounding name, chosen with precision so as not to arouse suspicion. Anne was not a spy nor a criminal. She was a woman determined to disappear from her own life. In Great Falls, she first worked as a waitress in a small cafe on the side of Highway 87. She saved every penny. She was discreet, friendly enough to be remembered fondly, but never deeply. After 3 years, now fluent in the name Anne, she enrolled in a night school for accounting technicians. She never used her real name, never made a fuss about her origins. To the world, she was a young woman with no past, just living in the present. In 1968, she met a local mechanic, Hank Miller, a widower, a Korean War veteran, and the father of a young son. Within a year, they were married. Anne never told the truth, not to her husband, not to her stepson, not to her friends in her new life. Hank believed his wife was an orphan from southern Illinois, raised by a distant great-aunt, a story Audrey had invented, now told with confidence, firmness, and rehearsed detail. Together they lived in a modest home with a well-tended flower garden, lovingly raised children, and quiet Sundays. Documents reveal that Anne Becker officially became a naturalized citizen in her own name in 1975, after applying for a new social security number, something that was possible at the time with limited records and without today's rigorous digitization. On paper, Anne had always existed. Audrey, to the system, had become a closed file, a name on a missing persons list. But what drives a 19-year-old woman to make such an extreme decision? The exact reason may never be entirely clear. However, in interviews given after her reappearance in 2025, she has left clues. Back then, no one listened to a young woman like me. They told me what I should do, who I should marry, how I should live. I saw the future closing in on me, and I decided to forge another path. In the 1970s, she worked as an accountant for small local businesses. She became a well-known figure for her competence, but little was known about her previous life. She was religious and attended local festivals, but never brought family from outside. One detail, any old photos of her quickly disappeared. If someone mentioned that she looked like someone else, she would politely change the subject. Hank died of cancer in 1999. Anne cared for him until the end, according to hospital reports. After her husband's death, she became even more isolated. She rarely traveled, wore modest clothing, and avoided social interactions. However, she began to write. Diaries, unsent letters, and short reflective texts were kept in a wooden box in the attic of the house. It was precisely this box that would catch the attention of a researcher, Ben Travers, a PhD candidate in contemporary history at the University of Montana, interested in hidden biographies and undocumented lives of 20th century women. By cross-referencing documents and checking for inconsistencies in the data in some of the city's civic records, he noticed patterns. Anne's birth certificate was generic. The school where she claimed to have attended had no records of her. What's more, her signature matched a sample found in Stoughton school records, the same ones that had been analyzed decades earlier. Ben sought out Anne, and in a tense but revealing encounter, she confirmed the truth. You won't understand. No one understands, but I lived the life I wanted to live. He asked her if she felt guilty, if she thought about the family she left behind. She replied, I thought about them every day, but sometimes love is also walking away. I didn't run away from life. I ran towards something bigger. In 2025, at the age of 82, she introduced herself to the local press as Audrey Backerberg, the name she had abandoned. She did not ask for forgiveness, nor did she show any regret. Her speech was direct, firm, almost serene. It was not easy. It never was. But it was my choice, and I lived each day as if I knew what I was doing. The revelation exploded in the media. For most, she was a kind of living legend. For others, a cold woman who abandoned those who loved her. For some, an inspiration about freedom and reinvention. Amid the reactions, Audrey stood her ground. She said she was not seeking absolution, she just wanted the story to be complete. Audrey Backerberg's return to the city of Stoughton in mid-June 2025 was silent, without fanfare. There were no cameras, no press conference, no public ceremony. Just an 82-year-old woman slowly getting out of a rented car, walking with firm steps through the same streets where she had grown up, now completely transformed by time, but still recognizable to those who carried in their minds every detail of her childhood and youth. The corner drugstore had become a modern coffee shop. The school where she studied was now closed, awaiting a renovation that never came. The houses seemed smaller, the trees bigger. And time, cruel and honest, was on everything. Audrey returned not to be welcomed with a party, but to face the debris of the time she herself chose to abandon. In the town, there were still those who remembered the name. The older people, upon hearing about Audrey's reappearance, reacted with disbelief, shock, and even anger. Some saw in her the betrayal of a daughter of the land who chose to disappear. Others, in silence, respected her courage to return. But the most eagerly awaited and most feared reunion was with the surviving siblings. Peter and Ruth, now elderly, both with children and grandchildren. They were contacted in advance. Initially, they hesitated. They said they did not want to open old wounds. But in the end, they accepted the meeting. And it was at that moment that the emotional layers of the story became as intense as the disappearance itself. The reunion took place in the old Backerberg family home, now owned by Ruth. There were no immediate hugs, nor any smiles, just a deep silence, lasting almost a minute, in which the three looked at each other as if trying to recognize in each other's eyes the lost decades. Ruth was the first to speak. Her voice trembled. "Why, Audrey?" The question carried no anger. It carried a gentle pain, hardened by the years. Peter said nothing. His hands were folded, his gaze fixed, as if trying to decipher the woman in front of him. Audrey sighed before answering. "Back then, I didn't see a choice. I felt that if I stayed, I would disappear in another way. I had to leave to survive." The conversation continued heavy, with long pauses, sentences interrupted by memories that exploded in the middle of the room. Ruth recalled her mother's despair, the nights crying in the hallway, the incessant searches. Peter, visibly more restrained, said that he had built his life trying to forget. "You killed a part of us," he said, "not with malice, but with silence." Audrey listened to everything respectfully. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to justify each act. She simply acknowledged, "I knew this would hurt, but I still did it, and I don't regret it." That sentence, spoken firmly and calmly, had an impact. Ruth cried. Peter went outside to breathe, and there, in the center of the room, Audrey remained seated, holding a cup of tea that trembled slightly in her hands. She did not ask for forgiveness, but she did not demand understanding either. Her return was not a confession, it was a testimony, an act of closure. After the reunion, Audrey stayed in the city for 3 days. She visited the old cemetery and laid flowers on her mother's grave. She walked past the old school and chatted briefly with neighbors from decades past. At every corner, she was met with unspoken questions, suspicious looks, and veiled curiosity. And she accepted it all with a serenity that for many was disconcerting. She did not hide who she was, but she also did not regret what she had experienced. In interviews, she said, "Life is a collection of choices. Mine was radical, but it was conscious." During those days, Audrey also gave a statement to the Dane County Police Department, officially closing the state's longest-running missing person registry. The officers listened in silence. She had lived her entire life under another identity, without crime, without financial fraud, without misdemeanors, only the desire to be someone else. And this, despite going against emotional and social logic, was not illegal. The national media immersed themselves in the case. Television programs, podcasts, digital magazines. Everyone wanted to understand who this woman was, who disappeared in the prime of her youth and returned in the twilight of old age with a story that sounded more like a movie script. Experts in human behavior and psychologists were interviewed to try to explain the phenomenon. Some said she suffered from dissociation caused by invisible traumas. Others called her a silent feminist heroine, but no one had a clear definition. Because the truth is that Audrey did not fit into easy labels. She didn't seek fame. She didn't write books. She didn't try to profit from her story. She just told it. And that in itself is rare in today's world. In her last interview before returning to Montana, where she would live out her final years in a nursing home, she said, "I was Audrey, I was Anne, and in the end I am both. One chose silence, the other chose freedom." Audrey Backerberg's reappearance wasn't just headline news. It became a mirror, the kind that when we look into ourselves, we see something more than just the reflection. The story of this woman who disappeared voluntarily in 1962, lived another life for more than 60 years, and returned without apology, sparked a wave of profound and polarizing discussions in the United States. TV shows, opinion columns, online forums, and universities all immersed themselves in the case. turning a silent life into a national issue. It wasn't just about Audrey anymore. It was about what she represented. At the heart of this conversation was a fundamental question: what does it mean to be yourself? Audrey, who spent most of her life as Anne Becker, showed that identity can sometimes be an act of will, not just a family inheritance or a consequence of where we were born. Her disappearance was not impulsive. It was planned, a silent plan that involved courage, risk, and a deep conviction that remaining in her original life meant dying spiritually. And it is precisely this idea that has generated such intense reactions. On the one hand, many saw her as a symbol of emancipation. On social media, the term Audrey was free began to circulate among young women and movements that advocate radical autonomy over their own destiny. For these groups, Audrey represented the refusal to accept the social constraints imposed on women in the 1960s: arranged marriage, moral expectations, silent submission. She had, in her own way, carried out a kind of personal revolution. On the other side, there were harsh accusations. She was called selfish, cold, and ungrateful. She abandoned her family, destroyed the emotional stability of those who loved her, and never offered real comfort. Conservative programs denounced the irresponsible romanticism of her escape and argued that valuing this type of story could encourage dangerous behavior, especially in times when the family structure already faces cultural pressures. In the midst of this crossfire, scholars have tried to put things into context. Professor Lawrence Klein of the University of Chicago, a specialist in social psychology, wrote in an article that Audrey had a limit experience. Then he compared her to historical cases of people who changed their identities during wars, political persecution, or personal breakdowns. But what made Audrey's case unique was the absence of external threat. She wasn't running from the law, war, or famine. She was running from something more abstract, from the feeling of not fitting into the life that had been designed for her. And for many, this was unacceptable. Because if Audrey could reinvent herself, disappear, and not regret it, then what was stopping anyone from doing the same? And what would happen to social, emotional, and family ties if everyone decided to act like her? Audrey's story raised ethical dilemmas. Where do individual rights end and duties to others begin? Is there absolute freedom? Or does all freedom come with the price of guilt? Yet Audrey herself, in her interviews and statements, never tried to present her choice as an example. "I'm not a model for anything," she would say. "I just did what I felt I had to do." She didn't use ideological terms or elaborate speeches. She was simple and direct. There was an intimidating rawness to her speech. "I didn't run away from the world. I just ran away from the expectation of being someone I wasn't." This sentence, reproduced in newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, became a kind of moral enigma for readers and journalists. Some thought she was a free and authentic soul. Others, that she was a broken woman, incapable of dealing with the weight of affection. Between both readings, perhaps, there was the truth. Audrey was a portrait of complexity. Sociologically, her case even inspired congressmen to raise the debate on renewable civil identity, a concept that proposed rethinking personal documentation systems in the US, facilitating, for example, name changes and legal redefinition of identity for people who want to start over after deep trauma. A bold agenda that, although still embryonic, had its genesis in the echoes of Audrey's story. And there is another aspect that cannot be ignored: time. The time that has passed for her and for us. 60 years of silence. 60 years in which she lived with the constant risk of being discovered, but never was. This was only possible because she lived on the fringes of digital life. She did not use social media. She paid her bills at the local bank. She left no traces. She was invisible in a world that, little by little, became increasingly traceable. And there lies a final thought. Could Audrey do the same today? In a world of biometrics, geolocation, algorithms, and facial recognition, how many Audreys can there still be? Her last months of life were peaceful, secluded, away from the spotlight. She maintained occasional contact with her siblings, but she did not rebuild intense bonds. She did not wish to, nor did she deny it. She simply accepted that every choice, even those that seemed wrong to the world, had a price, and hers was isolation. But it was a chosen isolation. The last months of Audrey Backerberg, or Anne Becker, as she was still called by many who knew her throughout her life, were marked by silence, contemplation, and a rare kind of serenity. After the whirlwind of reactions caused by her reappearance, she chose to retreat to a nursing home outside Helena, Montana. She did not seek any more interviews. She did not want documentaries nor public tributes. In her own words, spoken to a close caregiver, "I have said enough. Now I just want to hear the wind." Audrey lived in a small room overlooking a hill. She spent her mornings writing in a simple navy blue hardcover notebook, a kind of diary where she recorded thoughts, memories, fragments of untold stories. It wasn't an autobiography. There was no chronology. They were loose pages of her soul. Verses, reflections, questions that perhaps never expected answers. Between one entry and the next, she drew tree branches, nameless faces, the outline of a winding road. As if she were still walking, the caretakers at the clinic report that Audrey was a reserved but kind woman. She laughed easily, but kept her distance. She knew everyone's name, but never revealed much about herself. When asked directly about her story, she would respond with an enigmatic smile and say, "That part of my life has already been told. Now I just want to live the rest of it in peace." She visited the clinic's small library weekly. She read historical novels, especially those that portrayed strong, silent women. Sometimes she would spend hours staring out the window, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands. There was something profound about the way she observed the world, as if she saw beyond the landscape, as if she saw layers of time that others could not. And perhaps she did. After all, she had lived through what many only dare to imagine. The reunion with the siblings, which had occurred months earlier, did not happen again in person. Ruth and Peter kept in touch through letters, brief, respectful exchanges, without open blame. In them they talked about time, their grandchildren, the pains of old age. They never asked for explanations, not anymore. They had finally understood that Audrey's story was not a matter of forgiveness or understanding. It was a reality that they had to live with, and they did so with dignity. In one of her last letters to Ruth, Audrey wrote, "You asked me once if I would have done it all the same, even knowing the pain it would cause. And I still don't have a simple answer. But I do know this. I was alive every single day, even the hard ones, even the lonely ones. And maybe that's what matters most in the end." In early February 2026, Audrey suddenly fell ill. Pneumonia. Her health, although stable until then, quickly deteriorated. She refused invasive treatments. She said she was not afraid. She asked only to be left with her notebooks, a blue blanket and soft music in the background, preferably Debussy or Nina Simone. She was granted her care. She passed away at dawn on February 11th as the sun rose behind the mountains. The caregiver who found her said she had a slight smile on her face. Beside her bed lay her blue notebook, open to a page with just one sentence written in firm handwriting. "I was who I needed to be." Her death caused a new commotion. Newspapers recalled her story. Articles were reprinted. Special programs were aired. But this time, the repercussion was less about the scandal and more about its meaning. Many now spoke of Audrey with a certain quiet respect, the woman who dared to disappear and live her own way, the woman who died without apologizing, but also without defying anyone, just existing in her own way. The funeral was small, as she had requested in her will. Only 5 people were present, 2 friends from the clinic, a nurse and her brothers, no photographers, no broadcasts. She was buried under the name Audrey Ann Backerberg, as she wished, uniting the two names that defined her journey. Her simple tombstone bore only her name, dates, and the same sentence that closed her last page. I was who I needed to be. After her death, the diaries were given to a small oral history institute with permission to publish excerpts anonymously. And in the loose pages, the world was able to glimpse not only the woman who disappeared, but the one who chose to reinvent herself. Audrey Backerberg's story physically ended in February 2026, but the legacy she left behind lives on, not with monuments or authorized biographies, but with discreet echoes, like a melody that persists even after the last note. Her name, once just a forgotten entry in a missing persons database, has come to symbolize a broader human phenomenon: the deep, often unspoken desire to disappear in order to begin again. Her story has opened windows for discussions that go beyond sensationalism and morbid curiosity. It has touched on existential dilemmas that many people carry in silence. In the months following her death, universities, research centers, and social groups began to study the so-called Audrey effect. Behavioral psychologists began to study the narrative from the perspective of trauma and female agency. Sociologists used it as a case study on the boundaries between personal identity and collective expectations. And philosophers asked, what defines a person? Is it the name, the origin, the bonds, or the choices we make even when no one understands? One of the most visible impacts was on social media. YouTube channels, TikTok channels, and podcasts dedicated entire series to her story. Millions of comments were left by internet users saying, I understand Audrey. People who never physically disappeared, but who felt invisible in their own lives. People who admitted that they had dreamed of changing their name, their city, everything. Who had fantasized about leaving their cell phone at the bottom of a river, cutting their hair, getting on a bus and disappearing, not out of hate, but out of a thirst for authenticity. And that's where her impact is most powerful. Audrey didn't run away to survive. She ran away to live. Her story has become a mirror for everyone who feels that the script they've been given in life doesn't fit their soul. In a world that values productivity, constant exposure, and belonging to the masses, she dared to live small, under the radar, faithful only to her own inner compass. This idea resonated especially with older women who began to write about their own untold stories. On senior forums and online communities, stories began to emerge from women who, like Audrey, were raised in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s under rigid rules and uncompromising standards, and who quietly broke away from them. Her story gave voice to these other women who may not have disappeared like she did, but who carried within themselves the same desire to start over. There were also legal and political implications. A committee in the United States Congress, moved by the repercussions of the case, proposed a pilot project on the right to reinvent identity, allowing people in extreme situations to legally change their name and start over with psychological and social support, especially victims of violence, persecution, or deep emotional abandonment. Still under debate, the proposal is meeting resistance, but the seed has been planted. The city of Stoughton itself, which had long held Audrey's case as a collective trauma, changed its perspective. In October 2026, the City Council authorized a small exhibition at the local historical museum titled The Silences of Audrey. The exhibition brought together documents, newspaper clippings from the time, childhood photos, testimonies from residents, and a replica of the room where she lived her final days, silent, minimalist, with a chair facing the window. The exhibition, more than judging, invited reflection. And so a question arises that has stood the test of time. What do we leave behind when we choose anonymity? Audrey left a space empty for decades, but she filled that space with another life. A simple, real life, with coffee in the morning, clothes washed by hand, children raised, bills paid. Nothing grand, but completely hers. And that, for many, is what intrigues most. She didn't run away to hide from the world. She ran away to keep from losing herself. In a society that teaches us to mold ourselves to fit in, Audrey did the opposite. She broke the mold and reinvented herself, even with the pain that came with it. And perhaps that is why her story endures, not because of the act of disappearing, but because of the silent testimony that sometimes surviving emotionally requires radical ruptures. Her final sentence, "I was who I needed to be," continues to be printed on t-shirts, posters and posts, not as an empty slogan, but as an intimate provocation. Because everyone, at some point in their lives, needs to be who they really are, even if that means displeasing, disappointing, or disappearing for a while. Audrey Backerberg's story does not end with her death. It continues where many stories are born, in the silence of those who listen and in secret recognize themselves. She was not a traditional heroine, nor a fugitive in the shadows. She was a woman who, on an ordinary afternoon in 1962, decided to disappear, not out of desperation, but out of a decision that she herself called the only possible way to truly live. And this is the point that resonates most strongly. Audrey did not get lost. She found herself far from the place where she was born, far from the expectations of others, far from the name that was given to her. How many of us have felt this impulse, the desire to disappear, to escape a life that has swallowed us before we even know who we really are? How many have looked in the mirror and thought, "That person staring back at me is no longer me"? Audrey had the courage, or the desperation, to transform this anguish into action. And in doing so, she sparked a question that resonates to this day. Is complete freedom only possible when we are far from everything that holds us back? She didn't apologize. She didn't seek public forgiveness. She didn't make fiery speeches. She simply lived the way she wanted to live, and that, in a world that constantly demands justifications for everything, is in itself an affront and a declaration of independence. Audrey didn't want to teach us anything, but she taught us anyway. That real freedom costs a lot, that it demands connections, memories, hugs, faces, that it demands dealing with the weight of knowing that by choosing, one can hurt those left behind. And yet, she went. She followed the path, and she stayed on it, steadfast, until the end. This story, more than about a disappearance, is about identity, about courage, about the risk of living a life that is truly yours, even if no one else understands. Audrey was a daughter, a sister, a wife, an accountant, a widow, an elderly woman, a patient, a symbol. But above all, she was the master of her own destiny. May Audrey Backerberg's journey be a mirror and a window for each of us. A mirror to reflect on who we really are, far from the roles that have been imposed on us. And a window to glimpse the courage to start over, even when the whole world believes that the path is already set. Because, in the end, that's what life is, an eternal process of disappearing from the imposed versions to appear in the ones we choose to be. Now tell me, after hearing Audrey's story, do you still believe that disappearing is always an act of escape? Or is it sometimes one of the most profound acts of presence? Comment below how this story impacted you. And if you want to continue following stories that delve deep into the human soul, subscribe. Audrey's journey is over, but ours is just beginning.